Good evening, everyone. Hello. There's some seats up front. Dawn, it's wonderful to have you here. Come on up. I'm Serene Jones. I'm the president at Union Theological Seminary, and I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's lecture and conversation on James Luther Adams and the spirit of liberal theology then and now. I am very pleased to welcome you to what is sure to be an inspired discussion. It can't help but be inspired given the two communities who are participating in the creation of this conversation, Union Theological Seminary and our dear, dear friends at All Souls. And at the center of that conversation this evening, we have our own Professor Gary Dorian, the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. There is no better embodiment of James Luther Adams' theology and work in the world, in today's world, than Gary Dorian as a scholar, as an activist, as an inspired and inspiring church leader, as a teacher, of whom many students in this room can well testify, who conscientiously forms seminarians and professors for future generation, and a darn good friend to many people in this room. So I am very pleased to have you here and look forward to the lecture and to the conversation that will follow. And I'm very happy to now invite the pastor of All Souls, Galen Gingrich, to come forward. Galen?
Good evening, and thank you, Dr. Jones, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this gathering to celebrate the life and thought of James Luther Adams, and I'm delighted to have been handed the microphone. Any day you serve in the warm-up band for Gary Dorian is a super fine day indeed. I've been asked to speak briefly about the influence of James Luther Adams upon Unitarian Universalism. I will focus my attention quite narrowly on Unitarian Universalism as an emerging faith tradition. Gary will follow with a much more wide-ranging and cogent assessment of JLA's influence on liberal theology. James Luther Adams made Unitarian Universalism aware of three things: the centrality of Whitehead, the tragedy of history, and the necessity of power. Allow me to comment briefly on each of these gifts. First, through his teaching and writing, JLA made Unitarian Universalism aware of the central importance of the thought of Alfred North Whitehead, an early 20th century Cambridge mathematician who later became a philosopher and theologian at Harvard. No modern theologian, I would argue, has a deeper understanding of the natural world than Whitehead. A mathematician by training, Whitehead collaborated with Bertrand Russell in writing Principia Mathematica, widely viewed as one of the most important books of the 20th century. Whitehead's major philosophical work, published in 1929 under the title Process and Reality, takes with utmost seriousness the insights of Einstein's theory of relativity. Even the most recent scientific developments, such as string theory and even M-theory, seem almost to have been anticipated by Whitehead. And no modern scientist, I would argue, has a deeper understanding of the nature and necessity of the divine than Whitehead. From a close reading of the book of Nature, Whitehead argues that one cannot account for the creative advance of time and history without an understanding of the role of the divine, which Whitehead calls God. Beginning not with revelation, but with observation, Whitehead builds a bridge across the centuries-old divide between science and religion, between fact and value, between matter and spirit, between knowledge and faith. His central insight is that everything becomes whatever it becomes by virtue of how it relates to everything else. Whether you are a photon or a person or even God, your identity over time develops through a process of relating to everything else, hence the name by which Whitehead's thought has become known, process philosophy. In my view, Whitehead's thought is crucial to the future of Unitarian Universalism. I have been known to say that Unitarian Universalism will flourish to the extent that Whitehead comes to be viewed as its founding philosopher. As a movement, we are still in our adolescence, preoccupied by questions of our relationship to our immediate theological forebears. If we are to develop into a full-fledged religious tradition, we will eventually need to develop a theology that is fully our own, one that does justice both to the book of nature and to the book of Revelation. Thanks mainly to JLA, Whitehead can help us in that effort. Second, JLA gave Unitarian Universalism a sense of the tragedy of history. The persistence of war and other forms of interpersonal and institutional violence in human experience has posed a thorny challenge to religious liberalism, a centuries-old tradition of which Unitarian Universalism is perhaps the blithest forward flank. Religious liberalism tends to advocate a forward-looking view of history and an optimistic view of humanity. Rejecting the Calvinist view of humans as totally depraved, it generally views growth as inevitable, progress as irreversible, and human beings as perfectible. During the 1930s, Adams spent a considerable amount of time in Germany, where he observed firsthand the rise of Nazism. His experience convinced him that the basic tenets of religious liberalism needed to be revised. In his essay titled "The Changing Reputation of Human Nature," written in 1941, Adams says, "When we say that history is tragic, we mean that the perversions and failures in history are associated precisely with the highest creative powers of humanity and thus with our greatest achievements. The very means and evidence of progress turn out again and again to be also the instruments of perversion or destruction." In light of this paradox, Adams concludes, "Certainly, if there is progress, it is no simple configuration of upward trends. At times, it looks more like a thing of shreds and patches. The general tendency of liberalism has been to neglect this tragic factor in history." Because of this tragic factor, Adams insists that religious liberalism must come to terms with the necessity of power, his third gift to Unitarian Universalism. He puts it this way: anything that exists effectively in history must have form, and the creation of a form requires power. It requires not only the power of thought, but also the power of organization and the organization of power. For Adams, both justice and injustice are forms of power. Injustice is the wanton abuse of institutional power, and justice is the lawful exercise of institutional power. Adams gathered his revised view of human history into what he called the 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism. These 5 smooth stones, perhaps Adams' best-known legacy among Unitarian Universalists, represents the conviction that revelation is continuous, that relationships should be mutual, that our highest moral obligation is to build just and loving human communities, that good things will happen only if we use our agency as human beings to make them happen, and that the resources we have available to make meaningful change in our world justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. The curious thing about this list is that Adams chose to describe these essential qualities as smooth stones. It's an appealing metaphor. With smooth stones and some sand, you can construct a Zen garden, a focal point of calm and contemplation, of beauty and harmony. But Adams didn't get his 5 smooth stones from a Zen garden. As most of you know, the term derives from a duel between a Hebrew shepherd boy named David and a Philistine warrior named Goliath. As the Hebrew Bible relates this story, David chose 5 smooth stones from the river and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. After being mocked and ridiculed by Goliath, David took one of the smooth stones and put it in his sling, and he struck Goliath in the forehead, knocking him to the ground. David then approached Goliath and killed him with his own sword. This story certainly puts the 5 smooth stones into a somewhat different light. It forcefully illustrates Adam's point about power. It's a capability that can be wielded either for good or for ill. Which of these outcomes happened in the story of David and Goliath depends, of course, on whose side you're on, though the writer clearly views the outcome as good. In any event, Adam's point remains. History can turn out tragically if good people stand by and do nothing. For this reason, the wise use of power in the pursuit of justice is not only permissible, it's necessary. And this is the struggle all of us must take up. Despite the tragedy that still bedevils history and the consequent necessity to wield power, I agree with Adams. We should face the future with an attitude of ultimate optimism. Bolstered by the faith and faithfulness of those who have gone before us, you and I live at the intersection of prologue and possibility. What happens next is up to us. Thank you.
I'm Stephen Mott. It's good to be down here out of New England, because in New England I always have to spell it because they think I'm dropping an R and tell them it's like Mott's applesauce. I'm president of the James Luther Adams Foundation, and our mission is to preserve the intellectual heritage of James Luther Adams. When he retired, we raised money so that he could have secretarial help to continue his writing, and also to preserve the tapes, the home movies that were mentioned that Adams took in the early years of Nazi Germany. These home movies have now been expanded and preserved, and what we have now is a DVD in which on one side you have the movies, the home movies that Adam took. On the other side you have Adams and George Williams discussing what's going on in those home movies. We have a screen back there, and we'll be showing them during the what do we call it afterwards? And if you were interested in ordering one, James Stillman here would be of help to you. We also helped Adams write his autobiography, Not Without Dust and Heat, a quotation from Milton. Since Adams died, we continue to preserve the tapes and the papers. There's an Adams archive at the University of Syracuse, as well as at Harvard Divinity School. But also to have what we're a part of tonight is an annual James Luther Adams Forum on Religion and Society. in which the topics are either on Adams or on a theme that Adams was very interested in. And we do this annually. We started in 1996 and try to move it around the country to keep people aware of who James Luther Adams is. We call ourselves a foundation. That was before my time, but it's a little misleading. We don't have any endowment, but we continue through individual gifts and voluntary work. And if you notice your program, you'll have a list of the sponsors here for this meeting. But I just want to say my appreciation very much for Union Theological Seminary and All Souls Church for their excellent job of co-hosting this event tonight. So it's good to talk to you.
Well, thanks to Serene for that very generous introduction, and to Stephen for introducing the James Luther Adams Foundation, to Galen for that just wonderfully succinct and spot-on rendering of JLA's significance for the Unitarian Universalism. This occasion is beautiful and rare because very few theologians inspire a society that keeps alive their name and work. The Paul Tillich Society and Bernard Lonergan Congress have been rolling for decades, and 9 years ago, a handful of us belatedly formed a Reinhold Niebuhr Society. But I can't think of another modern North American theologian who has a society. And I'm grateful to Stephen and his board members who are here, and to Galen and David Robb at All Souls Church, to Kevin McGee and Joey Longley here at Union for organizing this year's gathering at Union. This is a great place to remember JLA because Union is thriving today. Union has a strong, creative, and brilliant president in Serene Jones. We have an outstanding faculty infused by a bunch of new faculty and led by a stellar dean, Mary Boyes. We have James Cone and Cornell West. How great is that? Above all, Union has wonderfully passionate, contentious, and challenging students whom we boast about constantly, although in truth they were already that way when they got here. JLA would have loved it here, and it would have gratified him to see that Union is flourishing. Tonight, I'm going to focus on one of JLA's favorite topics, the spirit of liberal theology. I'm going to try to say Adams a few times for the sake of variety, but his friends called him Jim, and the rest of us called him JLA. JLA was by far the most influential Unitarian religious thinker of the 20th century, even as he criticized the anti-theological humanism that dominated much of the Unitarianism of his time. His youthful religion had almost ruined him for religion. He was grateful not to miss his theological career, and he was a legendary teacher of things theological and ethical. He grew up in a fundamentalist home in Ritzville, Washington, where his father was a Baptist minister and farmer. James Carey Adams abhorred the liberal turn in the Northern Baptist Convention. He believed passionately in the fundamentals. He came to believe that dispensational doctrine was fundamental, and so he joined the Plymouth Brethren in 1914 when JLA was 13 years old. J.N. Darby and the Scofield Reference Bible explained how to understand the Bible. The world is hopelessly depraved. The Bible describes how the world will end. To be saved is to be snatched by God from the burning, and true Christians will be raptured out of the world. When JLA was 15, his father caught typhoid fever and lost his health. Adams had to support his parents and 2 sisters. By day, he studied at the University of Minnesota. By night, he worked at the railroad. By his senior year, JLA decided that he really hated religion. In a speech class, he railed against religion in every speech. His teacher gently observed that perhaps he protested too much, because obviously he was obsessed with religion. Since religion was his great passion, why not study it at a seminary, preferably a liberal one? That advice propelled JLA to enroll at Harvard Divinity School, on the theory that Harvard was sort of Unitarian and thus the most liberal of all seminaries. JLA studied theology with William Wallace Fenn, scripture with George Foot Moore and Henry Cadbury, and church history with Kearsarge Lake. He admired the scholarly seriousness of his teachers, but he chafed at their detachment. Did these people believe in anything besides scholarly achievement? It wasn't clear that they did. Harvard Yard beckoned to him, where Adams studied under Alfred North Whitehead and Irving Babbitt. Whitehead, at the time, was moving from physics and philosophy of nature to metaphysics, although his religious views were still pretty vague, even to Whitehead. Babbitt was a famous literary critic, opinionated, cheeky, eccentric, conservative, bordering on reactionary, and prolific. Babbitt was obsessed with Rousseau, whom he despised. In class, he pored over Rousseau's Confessions line by line, blasting its romantic individualism as the triumph of stupidity. Babbitt told his students that Rousseau's celebration of spontaneity, naturalness, and individuality gave the modern age the idiotic philosophy it deserved. Rousseau epitomized what was wrong with modern thought, everything that was wrong with modern thought. He played a major role in making the modern age stupid, so he had to be taken seriously, like a disease. On the other hand, admittedly, Rousseau wrote shimmering prose. Babbitt believed in a universal humanism that spurned theology and metaphysics. Sophocles was his hero, and religion was useful only in teaching humanistic values and the saintly virtues of renunciation and peace. By that standard, the best religions were Roman Catholicism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. For Babbitt, humanism was about the triumph of the disciplined higher will over triviality and ignorance. He looked down on the Hebrew prophets. He persuaded JLA that Paul was wrong about the bondage of the will, and he taught JLA to appreciate the Catholic doctrine of original sin. In politics, Babbitt was a Burkean defender of privilege and tradition. Babbitt took no interest in his students, except for the 3 or 4 that he selected every year to be his disciples. JLA was enthralled to be one of them. He questioned whether any congregation would pay him to preach Babbitt's gospel, and Babbitt advised him against ministry. Teaching was way better than ministry because teachers give exams. But JLA had come to Harvard to give religion a try, and he judged that the kind of ministry that he had in mind could only take place in the Unitarian Church. For 8 years, he ministered at Unitarian churches in Salem and Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts, which did not go very well. JLA struggled with the crisis of belief that entire time. Every week's sermon became a torture for him because he didn't know what he believed. Certainly he was some kind of humanist, but what kind? Christian? Post-Christian? Vaguely religious? Stoicist? He read theologians in search of an answer, plus Baron von Hugel, a scholar of mysticism. He went back to Harvard to study philosophy of religion, ruing that Babbitt had been right about ministry. If he couldn't preach religion, maybe he could teach it as an academic. In that frame of mind, he joined the Harvard Glee Club and spent a lot of time with Johann Sebastian Bach. One night, singing Bach's Mass in B minor at Symphony Hall in Boston, JLA had an epiphany. Quote, "My love of the music awakened in me a profound sense of gratitude to Bach for having displayed, as though through a prism and in a way that was irresistible for me, the essence of Christianity. Suddenly I wondered if I had a right even to enjoy what Bach had given me. I wondered if I was not a spiritual parasite, one who was willing to trade on the costly spiritual heritage of Christianity, but who was doing very little to keep that heritage alive. In the language of Kierkegaard, I was forced out of the spectator into the existential attitude, unquote. To get unstuck and thus go forward, JLA had to go back to the Christian tradition and not merely as an observer. Grounding himself in Christianity became for him a spiritual necessity, but he could only do that on modern terms, allowing liberal theology to interpret Christianity. JLA respected the 17th and 18th century rationalists who paved the way to liberal theology. He took pride that a lot of them were Unitarians: Joseph Priestley, Samuel Clarke, Charles Chauncey, and all that. But the rationalists lived in their heads. They didn't historicize their own theories or even the biblical text, and they had an inflated idea of what reason could prove and cure. Modern theology began with Kantians, who deconstructed the scriptural text, and with Immanuel Kant himself, who revolutionized modern thought by thinking rigorously about thinking. Kant redefined the limitations of reason. He made a colossal attempt to unite reason and experience, and he had a place for religion in moral reason, and so JLA had to start there where modern theology had started. Kant compelled philosophers to stop conceiving the mind as a passive receptacle, arguing that the mind is active in producing experience out of its transcendental categories. We view the world as spatial and temporal because time and space are necessary conditions of experience, not because they're out there somewhere as objects of perception. We experience anything only in and through the pure forms of sensibility, space and time. These representations are unified by the understanding, which contains pure concepts that Kant, following Aristotle, called categories. Human reason makes sense of the world by applying its a priori categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality to phenomena perceived by the senses. Before Kant came along, the march of materialism and philosophy just seemed unstoppable. Kant stopped it in its tracks by dethroning the things of sense, showing that powers of mind are fundamental in human life. On the one hand, metaphysics had a limited role in Kant's thought, and so did religion. On the other hand, Kant rehabilitated metaphysical reason around two conceptual pivots: the ideality of space and time, and the idea of a knowable and yet supersensible freedom. The idea of freedom belongs to practical reason, and it's the basis of true morality. Emphatically, Kant based religion on morality, not the other way around, because religion is essentially moral, and it has no claim to knowledge except by its connection to moral truth. In the realm of faith, Kant argued, something has to happen. Faith is personal and subjective, holding convictions that by their nature simply cannot be proved. The idea of God is a condition for the possibility of the highest good, the ground of moral truth. We cannot pursue the good if we don't believe it's real and attainable. Kant put it personally, quote, "I am certain that nothing can shake this belief, since my moral principles would thereby be overthrown, and I cannot disclaim them without becoming abhorrent in my own eyes," unquote. He could not imagine living with himself if he did not live in a moral universe. The alternative was moral nihilism and despair. Life has no meaning on those terms, and his passionate endeavors would have been pointless. Above all, Kant argued that freedom is the keystone to the vault of reason. All other ideas gain reality only by attaching themselves to the idea of freedom. If we do not insert the keystone of freedom, the vault will not work. Freedom is autonomy, the self-originating of moral law, the very desire and capacity to do the good. Freedom is a type of causality that determines laws for the intelligible world and that causes actions within it. If we do not believe in our freedom, we cannot trust anything that our reason tells us. Kant believed that human beings have radical evil within them, and we cannot bind our will to the good if we are not free. Kantian idealism was just obsessed with the moral necessity of freedom and the necessity of freedom for reason, notwithstanding that the entire so-called Enlightenment was just grievously infected with white supremacism and Eurocentric conceit. A great deal of liberal theology has been Kantian in a narrow sense of the term, and virtually all of it has been Kantian in a broad sense. Horace Bushnell, the great American 19th century theologian, once recalled that as a young man, in his early 30s, he realized one day that he had apparently become an atheist. He'd never really meant to become an atheist, but he realized he'd lost any real conviction of divine reality. The world looked blank to him, and he felt that existence was getting blank to itself. The heavy charge of his mortal being oppressed him, and he found that a kind of leaden aspect overhung the world. Finally, one day, he asked himself, well, in that case, is there nothing that I do believe? As soon as he said it, Bushnell realized that he had one belief, a moral intuition. He did believe there's such a thing as moral truth. He could doubt God, but not the good, which raised a question. Had he ever given himself to the good? Did he act like someone who believed that the good, whatever it is transcendently important? No, he had never done that. His life was superficial and pretty selfish. That gave him something to do. The idea of venturing forth in faith to pursue the good struck Bushnell as a kind of revelation. Devoting himself to the good was good in itself, and if he gave himself to it as he understood it, perhaps he would find God on the way. And so he became America's greatest theologian of the 19th century. If Bushnell had lost God in selfishness and skepticism, perhaps he would find the divine in giving himself to the good. That is the Kantian option, and nearly all of JLA's intellectual heroes had a version of it. The great Boston Unitarian, Theodore Parker, was one of them. Parker's idea of true religion rested on three claims, which he called transcendental. The intuition of the divine creates consciousness of divine reality. The intuition of moral right creates consciousness of a moral law transcending human will, and the intuition of immortality assures the continuity of individuality. To be sure, Theodore Parker exaggerated his Kantian credentials, since Kant did not conceptualize the categories of understanding in his fashion. But Parker had very good company in making that very move. The entire post-Kantian tradition of Friedrich Schelling, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. JLA took pride that early American Unitarianism was soaked in the richest tradition of modern religious thought, post-Kantian idealism, and he lamented that so many Unitarians were opting for mere humanism. There was a better option within the Unitarian tradition, he thought, blending Kant and Coleridge with Schleiermacher's understanding of religion, which left plenty of room for theology. Schleiermacher understood religion better than Kant did. Full-orbed modern theology began with Schleiermacher because he showed how to interpret Christian doctrines without making any appeal to an external authority. Schleiermacher accepted about 85% of Kant's system, but he argued that Kant misconstrued religion by reducing it to moral intuition. The wellspring of religion is spiritual feeling. True religion consists of an immediate relation to the source of life, a sense of the spirit of the whole. Spiritual feeling is a deeper aspect of human experience than reason or revelation or sensation. Rationalists look down on feeling as a low form of knowledge. Kant described feeling as a third faculty alongside pure and practical reason. Schleiermacher said they're both wrong. Feeling is not a form of knowing, and it's not a third faculty. It is self-consciousness as such, the autonomous, unifying dimension of the self that pre-reflectively apprehends the world as a whole. Kant reduced religion to moral control, the ordering impulse. Schleiermacher replied that true religion is not fundamentally about grasping anything. True religion is openness to the mystery of the whole and a sense of its infinite nature. Religion is about awe, worship, appreciation, mystery. In any moment, Schleiermacher argued, we're aware of our unchanging identity and its changing character. Self-consciousness always includes a self-caused element and a non-self-caused element, which he called the ego and the other. The ego expresses the subject for itself. The other expresses the coexistence of the ego with another. The self is an active subject and an object that's acted upon. This double movement of self-consciousness makes possible the feeling of being in relation with God, which Schleiermacher famously called the feeling of absolute dependence. We exist as feeling, active creatures in coexistence with each other, thrown into a world that we did not make. The world is the totality of being to which all judgments refer, and God is the idea of the unity of being to which all concepts ultimately refer. Thus, the idea of God is inherent in that of the world, but the two ideas are not the same. Both are transcendental terms marking the limits of thought, and each is the terminus of the other. They meet at the common border of God and the world, the unity of God and the world in feeling. These ideas were foundational for three of the four religious thinkers of his time that JLA admired above all others: Ernst Troeltsch, Rudolf Otto, and Paul Tillich. The other thinker was Whitehead, who did not read theologians, but Schleiermacher and Whitehead held a similar belief in the primacy of feeling. JLA found his voice by reading these religious thinkers, plus von Hugel. He was still supporting his sisters and widowed mother, so he had a heavy load. But he wrote articles on modern theology, and he aimed for a doctorate at Harvard. Then Meadville Lombard offered him a faculty position in 1935, and JLA worried that he was not ready for an academic career. He proposed to teach church and society, but Meadville wanted him to teach psychology and philosophy of religion, never mind that he knew very little about psychology of religion. He begged off for a year, vowing to get ready for a teaching career. He traveled in England, Germany, and Switzerland, befriending members of the confessing church in Germany. He lugged a movie camera to Germany and Switzerland, interviewing Rudolf Otto, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, Karl Barth, and Emil Brunner. Husserl told JLA that Barth's theology was unbelievable, but at least Barth had the guts to denounce Nazi Christianity, unlike most theologians. Jaspers told JLA that if he were religious, he would be Orthodox, because liberals didn't believe enough to keep a vital religion going. By then, Tillich was teaching at Union, and Adams admired Tillich for having offended the Nazi government. For the rest of his life, JLA showed his home movies to students, which is how I met him in 1975. He never tired of cautioning that Germany's glorious liberal tradition no longer meant anything in Germany, because German liberals rolled over for Hitler when it mattered. In 1936, he moved to Chicago to teach at Meadville, a bastion of Unitarian humanism. Faculty quoted the Humanist Manifesto approvingly. They took pride in having no theology, And JLA said that anti-theological humanism was not a good idea. Humanism was good, but Unitarianism was becoming insular as a consequence of being merely humanistic. That contention won him a faculty position at Meadville as an antidote to insularity. He loved his new home, and he became a popular teacher there. But intellectually, JLA identified with the theologians at the University of Chicago Divinity School, not his Meadville colleagues. Liberal theology, from the beginning, denied that an external authority should establish or compel matters of religious belief. 19th century liberals accepted Darwinian evolution, biblical criticism, and the idea of God as the personal and eternal spirit of love. Every mainline denomination had a battle over these issues, and most of them had a major split over them. Conservatives charged that liberals betrayed the faith and broke the line of continuity with historic Christianity. Liberals replied that religion had no future if it did not come to terms with modern science and historical criticism, and they usually denied that they broke the line of continuity with historic Christianity. But the Chicago School gave up this latter claim to continuity. The founders of the Chicago School, Shaler Matthews, George Berman Foster, Edward Scribner Ames, Gerald Burney Smith, contended that modernity is a revolution. If theology was to be truly modern, it had to rest on modern experience and critical tests of belief. The Chicago theologians were committed to historicism, history of religion, pragmatism, radical empiricism, and religious naturalism. Historicism. All knowledge is historical. Every idea has a history that's the key to its meaning and truth. History of religion. Religions must be studied by scientific standards not derived from any particular religious tradition. Pragmatism. Knowledge is instrumental. Concepts are habits of belief or rules of action, and ideas are true according to their practical usefulness. Ideas are like knives and forks, enabling useful action. The Chicago theologians got their pragmatism from William James and John Dewey, and they got their radical empiricism from James. Enlightenment empiricism studied experience, contending that sense data about things is all that we have and claiming to know anything. William James added, however, that experience is relational. Experience has a flowing, immediate continuity that can't be captured by focusing on atomistic units of experience. Life itself is a continuous flux or stream of experiences lacking distinct boundaries. By focusing on the relational flow of experience, the Chicago School practiced a form of process theology long before the term existed. For 30 years, the Chicago School liberals debated how far they should take their commitment to religious naturalism. Most of them conceived God as an expression of ideals, and they equivocated on whether God should be conceived as a cosmic reality. But is God merely an analogical expression for an idealized concept of the universe? If you are reduced to John Dewey's God, an idealized social convention, is it better to just give up the idea of divine reality? At Meadville, some said yes, while others sided with Dewey. At the Divinity School, the Chicago theologians puzzled over what they should say about God. In 1926, they heard that Whitehead had just published a new book titled Religion in the Making. With excitement, the Chicago theologians vowed to read the book. With total bafflement, they turned the pages. The book was advertised as a primer in religion, but they couldn't understand a single page of it. Ames and Case dismissed the book as completely unintelligible. Smith reported that he felt some affinity with it, but he could not say why. Matthews confessed, quote, "It is infuriating, and I must say, embarrassing as well, to read page after page of relatively familiar words without understanding a single sentence. But Matthews added that perhaps, just perhaps, the problem was not with Whitehead. After all, Whitehead had a genius reputation as a relativity theorist. Did anybody claim to understand him? Yes, it turned out there was one American expert on Whitehead, Henry Nelson Wyman, who gave a brilliant lecture at Chicago on Whitehead's thought and was promptly appointed to the faculty. Wyman told the Chicago theologians that Whitehead's religious philosophy was perfectly intelligible and it was extremely important. It showed that the existence and nature of God are revealed in the inherent structure of physical nature. It proved that the universe exists only by virtue of its order, which is aesthetic, loving, and not accidental. Bernard Maitland later recalled, quote, "It was as if shuttered windows in one's own house had been swung open, revealing vistas of which one hitherto had been unmindful," unquote. Wyman admired his new colleagues for pioneering an empirical, naturalistic, pragmatic approach to theology, but he could not fathom why they took so much interest in history, and he chided them for letting go of God's objective reality. History doesn't matter, because history doesn't prove anything. What matters is, what is it all about? In Wyman's view, liberal theology had become too sentimental. It shrank from defending God's existence, and it tried to make itself attractive by appealing to social concerns. That strategy was a loser. It drove the strong and intelligent people away from religion. Wyman admonished that theology had to become tough-minded again. Religion is pointless without God, but modern science negated traditional ways of conceiving God's existence. Wyman argued that whatever else the word God may mean, at bottom it designates the something upon which human life and the flourishing of the good are dependent. It cannot be doubted that such a something exists. If there is a human good, it must have a source. The fact that human life happens proves the reality of something of supreme value on which life itself depends. Wyman made that the object of theology. He conceived God as a structured event and theology as the analysis of the total event of religious experience. Wyman had a complex and conflicted relationship to Whitehead, and he later broke away from Whitehead's metaphysical system, although not as much as he claimed. Under Wyman's influence, Chicago theology became more objective, tracking the flow of experience in organic terms, describing empirical patterns of events. When JLA came to Meadville in 1936, he befriended Wyman, and he defended Wyman's basic approach. Wyman versus Whitehead soon became the issue at the Divinity School. JLA played a crucial mediating role in that debate, and Wyman later became a Unitarian. But in the 1930s, you had to be a Chicago schooler to believe that Wyman versus Whitehead was the issue in theology. In Europe, World War I had obliterated the moral idealism and cultural optimism that fueled liberal theology. In the USA, World War I was experienced very differently, and thus the war did not destroy liberal idealism here. It took the Great Depression in white America to do that. By 1932, a new generation of American theologians began to say that liberal theology was not a good idea. Reinhold Niebuhr was the leading debunker. Niebuhr's favorite epithet was stupid, followed closely by naive. Repeatedly, he charged that liberal Protestantism was both. Liberals actually believed that the world could be saved by reason and goodwill. Niebuhr explained, quote, "Liberal Christian literature abounds in the monotonous reiteration of the pious hope that people might be good and loving," unquote. That was pathetic, Niebuhr said. To make any sense whatsoever in the 1930s, American Protestantism had to move sharply to the left politically and to the right theologically. Unitarians had an especially hard time with Reinhold Niebuhr. He ridiculed the things they treasured. He blasted John Haynes Holmes very personally, and JLA spent a lot of time urging Unitarians that they could not just say no to Reinhold Niebuhr. I cannot take the time tonight to explain Niebuhr's complex, profound theological vision or the zig and zag of his politics. But the best theological liberals of that generation realized that they had to grapple with Niebuhr. They were a stubborn bunch. JLA, Wyman, Harry Emerson Fosdick, Edgar Brightman, in his way, the Black Social Gospel Way, Benjamin Mays, Georgia Harkness, George Buttrick, Norman Pittenger, John Haynes Holmes, Bernard Maitland, all of them identified with Fosdick's self-description. For them, it was either liberal religion or no religion at all. They believed in the liberal faith of reasonableness, openness, modernity, and especially the social gospel. The old liberals understood that their language of progress and idealism just seemed like sentimental mush in the depressing era of collapsing economies and political turmoil. But they stuck with liberal reformism in politics, resisting radical Marxism and other radical ideologies, and they shook their heads incredulously that Karl Barth was considered a great theologian. Liberal theology, whatever its problems, was still the only option that held together reason and faith as far as they could see. It had the right project, even if it didn't have all the answers. If liberalism was too deferential to modern culture, well, it had to be more critical. If the social gospel was too idealistic and sentimental, well, maybe it needed a dose of realism. If liberal theology read too much of its white middle-class moralism into the gospel, well, that had to be fixed. Fosdick gave sermons on every one of these topics. The mid-century liberals were willing to make adjustments of this kind, but they would not disown liberalism because to them, there was no better place to go. The crucial thing was to be able to worship God as the divine spirit of love without having to believe any particular thing on the basis of authority. Some alternative to orthodox overbelief and secular unbelief was still needed, even if liberalism needed better answers. JLA mediated a Christian version of all these convictions to the Unitarian community. He enrolled in Chicago's doctoral program when he moved to Meadville. In 1943, he made an obvious career move, joining his friends at the University of Chicago, where he founded the program in ethics and society. Once again, he scrambled to learn a field while teaching it. In 1945, he finally completed his doctorate, writing a dissertation on Tillich's Theology of Culture, the only book that he ever wrote. When he founded the social ethics program at Chicago, JLA kept three things in mind. One, social ethics was invented by the social gospel movement. Whatever problems the social gospel had, it was right to focus on reform movements for social justice and to use social science methods. Two, JLA vowed not to replicate his Harvard experience. His students would know what he believed and what he cared about. Therefore, three, he featured controversial topics in his classes, and he required doctoral students to pass exams in 4 social sciences. Knowing theology was good. Knowing social theory was good too. The ideal was to fuse prophetic theology and social theory to understand and change the world. JLA's intellectual models were big thinkers who wrote big books. Trelch, Otto, Tillich, and Whitehead wrote on a vast canvas, ranging over religions, philosophies, and disciplines. They were not afraid of metaphysics or feeling, and they had a sense of transcendent mystery. JLA was like them in every case, except that he was not a book writer. He wrote short essays on big themes, and he had a religious ideal, faith for the free, which blended Whitehead's lure of love divine with Tillich's principle of ultimate concern. Human beings depend for their being and freedom on a creative power and process that are not of our making. God is the commanding reality that sustains and transforms all life. Following Tillich, JLA taught that God is a name for the infinite depth and ground of all being. To speak of God is to refer to one's ultimate concern. Atheism is the notion that life has no depth. That is a very strange idea, JLA would say. Who really believes that reality does not sustain meaning and goodness? Of course, that was putting it in Wyman's fashion, not in Tillich's. Moreover, divine reality finds its richest focus when human beings cooperate for the common good. Freedom, rightly used, seeks freedom and social justice for others, and freedom in community cannot be achieved without, as Galen said, the power of organization and the organization of power. Adams despaired of the kind of religious liberalism that encouraged individuals to just believe whatever they wanted. Often he admonished that individualistic liberals dropped the first principle of good religion, the existence of a commanding divine reality. They got stuck in a halfway house denialism by treating liberty as the only spiritual truth. JLA insisted that genuinely free religion is always about life-giving community, and it takes place within one. A faith that creates no community of faith is merely a protection against having a real faith. JLA loved to quote Whitehead on that topic. Definition is the soul of actuality. A group that cannot define itself or get its act together cannot do any good in the world. There is no real faith without a community and its structures of accountability. To do the good, one must exercise power in a manner that is enabled and limited by its divine ground. JLA never tired of saying that power has a theological ground as an expression of God's love and a human sphere of action as the exercise of freedom, a response to the possibilities of being. Freedom is participation in power, and power is the ability to achieve a purpose. To be a moral agent, one has to take responsibility for the power that one possesses. All can be free, but only if all are empowered to participate. Every year, JLA surprised a new group of students by telling them he believed in natural law. Check your prejudices, he would say, because natural law doesn't have to be conservative or dogmatic. No one actually knows the law of nature. To approach it, you must be patient, humble, keep an open mind, root out your prejudices, be aware of your context, and remember that every interpretation is fallible. But however difficult it may be to grasp the one within the many, the value of trying should not be denigrated. We must at least be open to the possibility that the moral life has a universal ground. JLA made most of his impact by befriending people, teaching popular courses, and working in civic organizations. In the 1930s, he helped to revitalize the American Unitarian Association, which produced new programs and outreach efforts that led to the founding of the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961. In 1944, he threw himself into Chicago politics, co-founding a powerful reform organization, the Independent Voters of Illinois. This organization campaigned for international cooperation, racial integration, civil liberties, and liberal politicians, notably Adlai Stevenson, whom JLA befriended. In 1954, Adams cheered the Brown decision. 2 years later, he urged Stevenson to support the civil rights movement. Sadly, very sadly, that was not to be. The 1956 presidential campaign marked a low point for liberal politics in this country. Lightning had struck in Montgomery, but the busing issue was singular and hard to replicate. The civil rights movement was floundering. Martin Luther King didn't know what to try next. The South boiled over, and Stevenson carefully avoided outflanking President Eisenhower, who did nothing, exactly as Reinhold Niebuhr advised. Years later, JLA felt the shame that history conferred on the Stevenson campaign. Meanwhile, Harvard Divinity School called, and JLA agreed to come home. Harvard Divinity School had precipitously declined in the 1930s. Then it further declined throughout the 1940s. Then it kept declining in the early 1950s. Harvard had only one theology professor, and he was a humanistic atheist who didn't want to teach theology. But in 1953, the university got a new president, Nathan Pusey, who revived the Divinity School. JLA, Paul Lehman, Krister Stendahl, and Frank Moore-Cross joined the faculty. Tillich moved from Union to Harvard Yard, and JLA grew into his later legend, teaching afternoon seminars that sprawled into evening seminars and his living room. He told students that he regretted having neglected his scholarship, but in the next breath he would urge them not to lock themselves in the library. Give yourself to at least one activist organization, he would say. The best ones make democracy work for everybody. Groups like the NAACP and the ACLU. When I got to HDS in the mid-1970s, JLA was very much a local legend and presence, much like Harvey Cox is today. Adams did not like it when students gushed over him as the grand old man of HDS. He was too committed to his causes to be sentimentalized or not taken seriously. He once told me that he could live with a lot of theologies, but people with bad politics really pissed him off. On one occasion, however, I saw him reach the limit of his legendary theological tolerance. Young Jim Wallace came to Harvard to promote his magazine, then called the Post-American, later called Sojourners. This will be hard for some of you to believe, but back in those days, Jim was a terrible speaker. Just awful. He mumbled. He rambled. He spouted slogans. But this was fashionable at the time. Young speakers thought that speaking badly made them authentic, unlike the orators from the old left that we didn't trust. JLA understood all that. What annoyed him was that Jim repeatedly called himself a Bible-believing evangelical. Every time that Jim said it, JLA growled and stirred in his chair. I was sitting next to him, and I could feel the explosion coming. Finally, Adams couldn't take any more, and he cut off Jim in mid-sentence. Do you believe the sun stood still for Joshua? Have you ever had the intellectual honesty to think about what it would mean to believe that? Jim replied that he had not come to fight about such things, and JLA backed off, as this was already an unusual episode. Normally, he was a paragon of hospitality. But it bothered him that the new evangelicalism did not seem to be interested in rethinking evangelical theology, only its politics. JLA was a critical and comparative thinker, not someone who developed the logical implications of a single point of departure or thinker. He was a master teacher, even though many of his protégés did not think in his fashion, and most of them had trouble describing even what it was. Max Stackhouse said there was no thread connecting JLA's thought. At least he could not find one. Jim Gustafson said the same thing. But then Gustafson reconsidered, realizing how that sounded. If anything held together JLA's work, Gustafson said, it was the idea that free women and men put their faith in a creative reality that is recreative. Actually, that put it very well. Although JLA drank deeply from big thinkers, he did it in a way that left their systems in the background. His faith in a creative reality that is recreative smacked of Whitehead, but metaphysical scholasticism was just foreign to him. JLA was as deeply indebted to Trelch and to Tillich as he was to Whitehead, but he never stuck with one big thinker or one big idea. He was a back and forth guy, comparing alternatives and bringing people together. In his last years, he marveled that his former students, Stackhouse, J. Ronald Engel, Kim Beach, worked hard at fashioning his scattered essays into books. That was a beautiful thing. JLA, who collected Tillich's essays but never collected his own, had disciples who understood the importance of keeping him in print. Social gospel idealism burned in JLA to the end of his days. So did the deeper wellspring of religious idealism that he shared with Schleiermacher, Schelling, Parker, William Ellery Channing, Trelch, Otto, Tillich, and King. The great I am of Exodus 3:14, God telling Moses to tell the Israelites that I am had sent them, expresses the identity of thought and being, the very keynote of idealism. All knowledge participates in divine self-knowledge. On the level of spirit, subject and object are identical, each involving the other. A subject becomes a subject by the act of constructing itself objectively to itself. But a subject is not an object except for itself. Idealistic theologies theorize this self-reflection of spirit overcoming the dualism of subject and object, as in the classic theologies of Neoplatonism, Augustine, Meister Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa. Immanuel Kant did not set out to revive this tradition, but he did so anyway, on modern terms, by thinking about how the mind intuits objects of sense data and constructs a world. Grinding his way through a notorious tangle of dense transcendental argument, Kant resorted to a concept of intellectual intuition, which scared him. He employed this idea in the Critique of Pure Reason, and he featured it more explicitly in the Critique of Judgment. He needed an idea that helped him reason about beauty, organic relations, the wholeness of creation, and what he called the manifold of intuition. But the idea of intellectual intuition felt dangerous to Kant. He didn't follow through on it because the more he relied on it, the less he felt that he was in rational control. To follow through takes some daring. Ultimately, the principle of subject-object identity is not about the self-knowledge of a finite subject. It's about the self-knowing of the divine within a finite subject. Once you head down this path, it is very hard to avoid metaphysical theology. Spirit realizes itself as a perpetual self-duplication of one power of life as subject and object, each presupposing the other. If God is the I am of truth, then reality is the self-thinking of spirit. In that case, as Hegel argued, what matters is not so much that we know the divine, but that the divine knows us and especially itself through us. Hegel was the greatest thinker who followed through. He put dynamic panentheism into play in modern theology. His rationale for a universal religion of spirit unified the ambitions of modern thought, and he inspired nearly every great philosophical movement of the past 2 centuries. For Hegel, God's infinite subjectivity was an infinite intersubjectivity of holding differences together in a play of creative relationships, not dissolving into sameness. God is the intersubjective whole of wholes, irreducibly dynamic and relational. Spirit becomes self-conscious in religion. Religions select the shapes that fit their spirit, and Christianity is a picture story about spirit embracing the suffering of the world and returning to itself. But Hegel, the most powerful of all idealistic thinkers, was also the most problematic because he threw away the two greatest strengths of the idealistic tradition: its emphasis on ethical subjectivity and its insistence that all thinking about God is inadequate, a mere pointer to transcendent mystery. Hegel sublimated God and selves into a logical concept, and he ridiculed Schleiermacher for theologizing about mere feeling. He treated notions as ultimate reality and real things as exemplifications of notions. Hegel notoriously lacked humility in tracking the world process, which he called the realization of spirit as self-conscious reason. So JLA did not count Hegel among his intellectual lodestars, even though there was a great deal of Hegel in Trelch, Otto, and Tillich. Hegel's intellectualism spurned the emphasis on feeling, willing, and ethical struggles for justice that define and fuel religious idealism at its best. The post-Kantian tradition had a long run in philosophy and theology until the natural sciences took over the academy, philosophy turned positivist, and Karl Barth steered theology away from the puzzles of subjectivity. This tradition would have fallen even further in theology had Tillich not kept it alive, and JLA treasured Tillich for that. Today, however, the debate that cuts across the sciences and humanities is an echo of the very arguments that post-Kantians pressed for decades. In the language of today, it's the debate between dead matter materialists and proponents of relationality, holism, and emergence. The School of Whitehead has played the leading role among theologians in battling a powerful reductionist tide in the academy and popular culture. From a common sense standpoint, the world consists of material things that endure in space and time, while events are occurrences that happen to things or that things experience. In the Whiteheadian conception, events are the fundamental things, the eminent movement of creativity itself. Minds are real but thoroughly natural. The universe is oriented toward beauty and the intensification of experience, demonstrating an inherent tendency toward complexity, self-organization, and the production of emergent wholes that are more than the sum of their parts. God is the lure of love divine for creative transformation and the flourishing of life. Whitehead's theory of creative complexity has a big problem with the second law of thermodynamics. And Whitehead's God can only be nice, unlike Yahweh, who was free to be terrible. A reliably nice God is a projection of human altruism. But no cosmology fits with everything that we know, which is vastly exceeded by everything we don't know. The Whiteheadian school deserves credit for grappling creatively with big questions and just having the sheer audacity to be a school and to keep one going. I have only one foot in it, but I'm just so grateful that one exists. It founded the Religion and Science Dialogue through Ian Barber and the Christian-Buddhist Dialogue at the American Academy of Religion through John Cobb. The Whiteheadian school has produced much of the most compelling feminist theology of our time, as in the writings of Catherine Keller and Rebecca Parker. It has UU advocates, notably Galen and Tendeka, and it has produced a gusher of ecological theory and activism. This school of theology began with Chicago school academics who privileged liberal questions of skeptical disbelief, but today it is known for privileging the issues of ecology and social justice. How can our religious communities play a role in the environmental movement and in the struggles of oppressed and excluded people? Today, we are witnessing a new Black freedom movement in the wake of Ferguson. It is perfectly named. conveying immediately what must be said, that black lives have never mattered in much of white America. Today, we are witnessing an upsurge of interfaith community activism against racism, poverty, and environmental destruction. PICO is thriving. IAF and Gamaliel are hanging in there. DART is training more organizers than ever. Interfaith worker justice is retooling for its second generation. And there is more interfaith community organizing going on today than ever. JLA would have loved that. Community organizing is inherently limited. It has trouble scaling up, and it burns people out. But it builds personal relationships across racial, ethnic, sexual, religious, and class lines. It empowers marginalized communities, and it does these things better than any kind of social justice activism that I've ever been part of or that I know of. The last time that Union had a JLA celebration, the year was 1981. JLA was 80 years old, and Don Shriver was president of Union. Don had studied under JLA in 1959, and he said that to study under Jim Adams was to be graciously assaulted by the booming, buzzing confusion of historic human reality. Don stressed that Adams didn't write very much. He used the word fugitive to describe JLA's essays in scattered journals. But that got Don rolling on a striking analogy. JLA wrote scattered essays, and Jesus didn't write anything. Jesus trusted his disciples to write things down, to the extent that he may have thought about it, and JLA left it to his protégés to create books out of his essays. JLA truly believed in incarnation, Don said. The Word becoming flesh. That was what made him an unforgettable teacher. His incarnational method fused the high ground of theology with the low ground of ordinary human relationships. His classroom was a place of hospitable community. JLA did not make learning painless. He made painful things possible, exposing ignorance, testing tentative ideas, challenging students to reach higher. He was an apostle of putting back together the fragments of our humanity that pride, prejudice, oppression, and its sins have alienated. Don put it theologically. Truth ultimately bears a human likeness, is revealed in human shape, becoming our servant, colleague, teacher, friend. You might call it a Unitarianism of the second person. But whatever you call it, it is something remarkable. Blessings and thanks, friends, to all of you. I'm told we're supposed to go straight to this reception. I don't know. I think maybe we could have a two-question limit. Do you think we could do that? Can we go for that? Two questions? If we've got them, I just feel like it's sort of a violation of your behavior. You sat here and listened to all this, and just nobody gets a chance to ask something or we get into something. So I am inclined to, if we can, to have at least a couple questions. Little bit of back and forth, and then go to our reception. It's all set up for us right here. President Shriver.
There are those of us who were the recipients of a large sheaf of genuine and exploratory, intellectually structured letters from Jim Adams. He was a great correspondent, and he complimented his graduate students by paying exquisite attention to their thinking as well as to the thinking of this galaxy of intellectual heroes that you have now ushered us through. I've heard it said that of ministers that they cannot afford to become friends with people of their congregation. They can't be leaders and spiritual intellectuals that way. He was a profound contradiction to that, and I wonder what your take is on the notion of whether teachers become great through their friendships with their students.
Thank you, Don. Firstly, I just need to say it just made this evening for me when you walked in. I was not sure you were going to make it. You were a little late, but thank you. Thank you for coming. JLA had the gift of friendship. He had it just abundantly. He had it just on a level that very few people have. And so I think he could appreciate why that maxim about not making friends and don't try and that trouble lies that way, that's something he could appreciate. Works for many. I just think, though, in his case, it would have been such a violation of his being, he could not have functioned in any context on those terms. He simply can't be himself at all, and he is someone who therefore showed his whole life that indeed this can't just be one of those no exceptions kind of absolutes. That can't work because it works exactly in the way that you experienced, and that everyone who knew him talks about. So he is something of an exemplar to me in that way. I am someone who has a similar sort of proclivity about I want students to think of themselves my friend. I feel badly when they don't, and there is danger in that. And I have nowhere near the charism or ability, that JLA had. So the fact that he did it is something of an inspiration to me every day. So thank you, friend. One other. Yes. John.
I begin by saying that was just a breathtaking intellectual adventure, the likes of which I've rarely heard. I get to hear a lot of good lectures. So thank you. That was astonishing. I have a question that comes from ignorance, but also from genuine desire. You know that I myself am trying to get elements of Tillich and Whitehead together in a lot of what I'm doing. And I'm wondering to what extent JLA managed to do that. Specifically, I'm wondering about the point that you made, namely Whitehead's nice guy. The more God becomes the ground of being, the less you can have the God who is the nice guy or nice gal.
Yeah.
You really have seething potentialities that are sometimes creative and sometimes destructive, and both are in some sense part of the divine life. And I think Tillich tried to clean it up, but it's hard to know to what extent he ever did clean it up. I think he kept a certain tension there. What I really want from Whitehead is not the nice guy, but the sense that the divine life is actually enriched by the life of the world. So that's what I want to get from Whitehead. I don't know that Tillich can give that to me. Maybe just a hint in the last 15 pages of Volume 3. But these are the kinds of things I'm trying to get together. I'm wondering, what are the elements from Tillich and Whitehead that he wanted to get together, and what do you think he actually managed to?
Yes. Oh, thank you, John. That's an extraordinary question. It's just exceedingly rich, and we can just scratch the surface here. But this whole question is powerful, it's motivating, and driving for Tillich long before Whitehead came along, because this has to do with what he appropriates from his own background in German idealism, and he's deeply invested in the post-Kantian German idealist who's the best on this subject. That's Schelling, right? I mean, Schelling has seen the abyss in existence. Tillich says that. So that seeing it in Schelling needing to break from the stream of books that he's written, and after he writes his book on freedom, he's experienced his wife suffers and dies, and he just allows the pain of the world to rush through him. This world-class genius who was writing books at the age of 19 suddenly can't publish again and doesn't publish a book for another 30 years because of the abyss. Tillich catches that, trusts Schelling more than any of these other post-Kantian idealists because of that very thing. And of course, Tillich himself, then what's the next episode in this story? He lives through World War I at the front, two massive nervous breakdowns, and at one point he only gets out of the French forest because he reads also Sprach Zarathustra, and Nietzsche gives him, something to go on, to be able and even, get up and get through. So Tillich then lives through just the sheer horror of the war. That he says, when I entered the forest, I was a dreaming innocent. When I came out, I was a wild man, and I had to do theology differently. But I think still, then, post-Kantian German idealism is just so deep in Tillich that he never repudiates. I don't think he even considers that as an option. It's so deep in him that it's part of his strength in being able to interrogate Nietzsche and Heidegger and every Marx, any radical thinker come along. Tillich has this just deep, profound wellspring in this whole tradition, especially Schelling, that it's just so second nature to him. He can't imagine even who he would be if he didn't have it. I mean, the problem for him is then he comes to a country that doesn't know about this. Philosophy is just, analytic stuff over here and over there, and, where can he teach that? He's lucky to be able to get to Union, where the faculty sort of lets him do it. This really is the issue for Tillich, I think, all along. His idealism is so powerful that idealism, just by its nature, it has a tendency to abstract, and you don't get particular, and it sort of blows away the hurt, the pain, the particularity. That just always it's danger. That's why, although I think all theology has to have this powerful idealistic element, it is also more dangerous than realistic theologies. I mean, a realistic theology that just theologized everything that's actual would just be grotesque, right? It'd just be morally grotesque. But idealistic theologies, given our object here, a mysterious transcendental object, of course, are idealistic, and yet they have the greater danger because of the intellectual hubris, the tendency toward intellectualism that's sort of built into it. And Tillich obviously is just fighting that off his whole career. I mean, he is so much. He's the epitome of that person I just described, but then struggling with the abyss in existence. Tillich had never met anybody from the working class until he went to war. Now that just blew him away, realizing that just what it meant to have a class perspective on everything that he considered important. Lastly, about this, John, I would say, this is just to go personal at the end here, the person who did the post-Kantian tradition and Whitehead better than anybody I know was William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury. In fact, this is how I ended up in the Episcopal Church. I didn't join a church until I was 29 years old. I was kind of putting it off. But I had a hard time, choosing one. But finally, I was just reading so much William Temple all the time, and I'm just deeply impressed that this guy he's a theorist of economic justice, and he's passionately committed to all these social justice causes, and he's a deeply spiritual human being, and he fuses Hegel and Whitehead like nobody else. And he did a lot of it on his feet while he's Archbishop of Canterbury giving the Gifford Lectures in 1933 and 34, and that's his great book, Nature, God, and Man. So that, I think, the road, was taken there with Temple, and it's, you and I have more in common even than you might have realized about all of this. But Thank you for that question, and thank you to all of you, friends. Good night.